When you hear the name Cleopatra, what comes to mind? Maybe you picture Elizabeth Taylor in a golden barge, surrounded by unimaginable luxury. Or you think of a powerful, beautiful queen, a legendary seductress who captivated the most powerful men in the world. For decades, movies and stories have painted her as a figure of romance and glamour, living a life of endless comfort. But this image, as dazzling as it is, hides a much darker and more tragic reality. The real story of Cleopatra's final days is not one of luxury, but of desperation, fear, and heartbreaking loss. Let's strip away the Hollywood fantasy and look at the real woman. Cleopatra wasn't just a queen defined by her beauty and her lovers. She was a brilliant political strategist, a skilled diplomat who spoke multiple languages, and a devoted mother. Most importantly, she was the last pharaoh of Egypt, the final ruler of a magnificent civilization that had lasted for 3,000 years. And in her final 10 days, she wasn't just losing a battle. She was watching her entire world, her heritage, and the future of her children crumble into dust before her very eyes. The clock starts ticking on August 1st, 30 BC. The forces of Octavian, her rival and the future Emperor Augustus, have breached the walls of Alexandria. Her partner, the Roman general Mark Antony, has just suffered a catastrophic defeat. The city she ruled is now a war zone. Imagine the sounds of chaos, the screams, the clash of steel echoing through the palace. For Cleopatra, this isn't some distant political game. It's the end of everything. Her army's gone, her navy has surrendered, and her people are at the mercy of a conquering army. In the midst of this turmoil, Antony receives false news that Cleopatra is dead. Consumed by grief and shame, he falls on his own sword. But he doesn't die instantly. Dying, he is carried to the mausoleum where Cleopatra has barricaded herself. Picture the scene. Cleopatra, with only her two most loyal servants, Iros and Charmian, using ropes to hoist the bleeding body of the man she loves through a high window. There, in her final sanctuary, Antony dies in her arms. This isn't a romantic movie scene. It's a moment of profound, raw agony. She has just lost her partner, her military commander, and the father of 3 of her children, and she is completely, utterly alone. Now, Octavian has her trapped. He sends his men to capture her, not to kill her, but for a fate she considers far worse. He wants to parade her through the streets of Rome in his triumphal procession. For a queen, a living goddess in the eyes of her people, this would be the ultimate humiliation. To be displayed like a common war trophy, her children chained alongside her, was a degradation she would never accept. She is now a prisoner in her own palace, under constant guard. During these days, Octavian meets with her. He tries to soothe her, making vague promises about her safety and her children's future. But Cleopatra is no fool. She's a master of political maneuvering, and can see right through his empty words. She knows his only goal is to use her as a symbol of his victory. The weight on her shoulders is immense. She is not just fighting for her own life, but for the legacy of her dynasty and the dignity of Egypt. Every choice is impossible. Should she trust the man who destroyed her? Should she hope for a mercy he has no intention of giving? The mental and emotional toll must have been unbearable. She is grieving Antony, terrified for her children, and facing the complete erasure of her life's work. Her eldest son, Caesarion, her child with Julius Caesar and the rightful heir, is being hunted down by Octavian's men. She knows he will be executed to eliminate any rival claim to power. She is a mother, helpless to protect her child from a brutal fate. This is the heart of her tragedy. The powerlessness of a queen who once commanded empires. So, on August 10th, Cleopatra makes her final move. The traditional story tells us a basket of figs was brought to her, concealing a deadly whether it was a snake or a pre-prepared poison. The choice was hers. It was her last act of defiance, her final assertion of control in a world that had taken everything from her. She dressed in her finest royal robes, not as a victim, but as the Queen of Egypt, choosing her own death over a life of humiliation. Her loyal servants, Iris and Charmian died, were there faithful to the very end. When Octavian's guards burst in, they found her lifeless, looking not like a defeated prisoner, but like a queen asleep on her golden couch. Cleopatra's final days were not about romantic surrender. They were a testament to her strength, her pride, and her love for her country. She was a ruler who chose to die a pharaoh rather than live as a Roman captive. The real story of Cleopatra is far more compelling than the myths. It's the story of a brilliant leader and a mother who, in the face, imagine a world dominated by a single, unstoppable superpower. A world where every kingdom, every king, every queen lives in the shadow of Rome's legions. This was the world Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was born into. But Cleopatra was no ordinary ruler, waiting for her kingdom to be swallowed by the ever-expanding Roman Republic. She was a force of nature, a political genius whose ambition and intellect would shape the course of history. Today, we're diving deep into the story of the real Cleopatra. Forget the Hollywood myths and the romanticized tales. We're going to explore the brilliant strategist, the multilingual diplomat, and the ambitious monarch who dared to challenge the most powerful empire the world had ever known. How did this one woman, ruling a kingdom on the brink, almost build an empire to rival Rome itself? Let's uncover the truth. To understand Cleopatra, we must first understand the precarious position of Egypt in the 1st century BC. For centuries, Egypt had been a cradle of civilization, a land of immense wealth, culture, and history. But by the time Cleopatra came to the throne, the glory days of the pharaohs were fading. The real power in the Mediterranean was Rome. Roman generals, senators, and politicians saw Egypt as a prize to be won, a breadbasket to feed their armies, and a treasury to fund their endless wars and political campaigns. The Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek royal family that had ruled Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great, was in decline. Cleopatra's own father had kept his throne only by paying enormous bribes to Rome, plunging the kingdom into debt. Internal strife was rampant, with siblings often fighting each other for the crown. This was the dangerous, high-stakes political chess game Cleopatra was born into. Survival meant outsmarting everyone around you, especially the powerful Romans who were always watching, always waiting for a moment of weakness. From a young age, Cleopatra proved she was different. While many royals of her time were content with a life of luxury, Cleopatra dedicated herself to her education. She was a true intellectual. Ancient writers tell us she was fluent in at least 9 languages, including Egyptian, Greek, Latin, and Aramaic. This was unlike her predecessors who primarily spoke Greek. Cleopatra was the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the native Egyptian language. This allowed her to connect with her people on a level her family never could, earning her their loyalty and respect. She wasn't just a foreign queen. She was there. Bypassed her rivals and allowed her to present her case directly to the most powerful man in the world. Caesar, a brilliant mind in his own right, was immediately impressed. He saw in her not just a beautiful woman, but an intelligent and capable ruler who could be a valuable ally. He sided with her in the ensuing civil war, and with the help of his legions, Cleopatra secured her throne. Their relationship was both personal and political. She gave him a son, Caesarion, and she spent time in Rome as his guest. This alliance with Caesar gave Egypt a powerful protector and solidified Cleopatra's destiny. It was a logical, strategic decision. Antony controlled the eastern provinces of the Roman Republic, the territories bordering Egypt. He was a seasoned military commander with a loyal army, and he shared Caesar's vision of a stable, prosperous East. Cleopatra met Antony at Tarsus, arriving on a magnificent barge, famously dressed as the goddess Venus. Once again, this wasn't just about spectacle. It was a display of wealth and power, showing Antony that she was not a desperate client queen but a powerful monarch, an equal partner. And an equal partner she became. The alliance between Cleopatra and Mark Antony was one of the great power couples of history. This was more than just a famous love affair. It was a political and military partnership of immense ambition. Together, they ruled over a vast territory stretching from Egypt through the Middle East and into modern-day Turkey. They had their own vision for the future, a future where the center of power might shift from Rome to the east, with Alexandria as its glittering capital. They organized their territories, conducted military campaigns, and presented themselves as a new divine couple, Antony as the god Dionysus, and Cleopatra as Isis. They had 3 children together, and Antony controversially declared them rulers of various eastern lands in a grand ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria. He also declared Caesarion, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, as Caesar's true heir. This was a direct challenge to his rival in Rome, Octavian, who built his entire claim to power on being Caesar's adopted. The propaganda was incredibly effective. Octavian consolidated his power in Rome and convinced the Senate to declare war, not on Antony, but directly on Cleopatra. This clever political move allowed him to hunt down Antony without officially starting another Roman civil war. The stage was set for a final, epic confrontation that would decide the future of the Roman world. The climax came at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC. It was a massive engagement, with hundreds of ships on both sides. Octavian pursued them to Egypt, and one by one, the defenses of Alexandria fell. Antony, hearing a false report that Cleopatra had already taken her own life, fell on his sword. He was brought to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where he died in her arms. Now, Cleopatra was alone, her army defeated, her partner gone, and her kingdom at the mercy of her most ruthless enemy. Octavian captured her and intended to parade her through the streets of Rome in his triumphal procession, the ultimate symbol of his victory. But Cleopatra would never allow herself to be humiliated in such a way. She was a queen, a pharaoh, descended from a long line of monarchs. She had lived as a sovereign, and she would die as one. In her final act of defiance, Cleopatra took her own life. The traditional story says she had an asp, a venomous snake and a symbol of Egyptian royalty, smuggled to her in a basket of figs. By choosing the manner and time of her own death, she robbed Octavian of his ultimate prize. She controlled her own destiny, to the very end. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended, and 3,000 years of pharaonic rule in Egypt came to a close. Egypt was annexed as a Roman province, its vast wealth now flowing directly to Rome, solidifying Octavian's now Emperor Augustus's power. The dream of a great Eastern Empire was extinct. He created a world of ruthless men and almost succeeded in building an empire that could stand against Rome. She lost, but she lost to the man who would become the first and one of the greatest Roman emperors. Her story is not one of failure, but of audacious ambition in the face of impossible odds. She remains one of history's most fascinating and formidable leaders. What do you think? Was Cleopatra a hero, fighting for her people, or an overly ambitious monarch whose gambles doomed her kingdom? The final act in the Roman Republic's long and bloody civil wars was unfought on land, but on the waves of the Ionian Sea. This is the story of the Battle of Actium, the moment that sealed the fate of two of history's most famous lovers, Antony and Cleopatra, and gave rise to the Roman Empire. By 31 BC, the Roman world was split in two. In the west, you had Octavian, Julius Caesar's calculating and ambitious great-nephew. In the east, there was Mark Anton, Caesar's legendary general, now allied with and captivated by Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. For years, these two titans, once allies, had been on a collision course. Octavian, a master of propaganda, painted Antony as a man who had abandoned his Roman heritage, bewitched by an Eastern queen with ambitions to rule Rome itself. He portrayed their relationship not as a romance, but as a threat to the very soul of the Republic. Tensions simmered, alliances were forged and broken, and finally, war was declared not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. It was a clever, political move that forced Antony's hand. He had to defend his queen, and in doing so, he became an enemy of the state. The stage was set near Actium, on the western coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant and experienced admiral, Marcus Agrippa, blockaded Antony and Cleopatra's forces in the Ambracian Gulf. Antony's ships were massive, powerful quinquiremes floating fortresses with heavy bronze rams. They were intimidating, but they were also slow and difficult to maneuver. Agrippa's ships, on the other hand, were smaller, lighter, and far more agile. They were the Liburnians, fast vessels that could dart in and out, harassing the larger ships like a pack of wolves surrounding a bear. 4 weeks, the two sides faced off. Antony's camp was ravaged by disease, and supplies were running low. Desertions were becoming common. It became clear that staying put was not an option. They had to break out. The plan was a desperate gamble. Antony and Cleopatra decided to punch through Agrippa's blockade and escape to Egypt, where they could regroup and continue the fight. They loaded their war treasury onto Cleopatra's fastest ships, a clear sign that this was not a battle for total victory, but a bid for survival. On September 2nd, 31 BC, the winds were favorable. Antony's fleet emerged from the Gulf, rowing hard to meet Octavian's waiting ships. The battle began. It was a scene of utter chaos. Agrippa used his smaller ship's mobility to his advantage, avoiding direct ramming attacks from Antony's giants. Instead, they swarmed the larger vessels, using archers and catapults to rain down fire and missiles, aiming to disable the oars and kill the crew. Antony's larger ships struggled to turn and respond, becoming isolated targets. Then, the turning point. At a critical moment in the battle, a gap appeared in the center of Octavian's line. Seeing her chance, Cleopatra, commanding her own squadron of 60 ships, hoisted her sails and made a dash for the open sea. This is where things get controversial. Was this a pre-planned escape, or was it a panicked retreat? We may never know for sure, but what happened next is undisputed. Mark Antony saw Cleopatra's purple sails disappearing over the horizon. In a decision that has baffled historians for centuries, he abandoned his men, his command, and his massive flagship. He left his entire fleet, still fighting and dying for him, without a leader. The effect on morale was catastrophic. Seeing their general flee the battlefield, the remaining ships lost heart. Some fought on bravely, but many surrendered. By the end of the day, what was left of Antony's magnificent fleet was either captured or sunk. Octavian had won an overwhelming victory. The aftermath was swift and brutal. News of Antonius' flight and the defeat at Actium spread like wildfire. His land forces, which had been waiting to support the naval battle, surrendered without a fight. His allies and client kings across the east, seeing that his power was broken, switched their allegiance to Octavian. The road to Egypt was now wide open. Less than a year later, Octavian's legions arrived at the gates of Alexandria. Cornered and abandoned, Antony took his own life, believing Cleopatra was already dead. When she learned of his fate and saw that Octavian intended to parade her through Rome in chains, Cleopatra chose her own end, famously by the bite of an asp. Their tragic end marked the end of an era. The Battle of Actium wasn't just a military victory. It was the final, decisive blow that ended the Roman Republic's civil wars. Octavian, now unchallenged, would return to Rome, adopt the title of Augustus, and become the very first Roman emperor, ushering in centuries of the Pax Romana. And it all turned on that one fateful day at sea. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more journeys into the past. They were not just physically tired, their spirits were broken. They had witnessed the naval disaster at Actium, had seen their fleet, their hopes, sink beneath the waves. Now, camped outside the city walls, they looked towards the horizon, not with defiance, but with a weary resignation. Hope was a currency scarcer than food. Cleopatra knew her commanders were losing faith. She would see it in their averted gazes, in the hesitation in their voices when they gave reports. Loyalty, once as solid as the stones of her palace, was now cracking under the immense pressure. Whispers of a different kind reached her ears, not from the streets, but from within her own ranks. Secret meetings were being held. Officers, men she had trusted, were contemplating the unthinkable: surrender. They spoke of saving their own lives, of negotiating terms with Octavian before it was too late. To them, the fight was already lost. The Queen was a sinking ship they were desperate to abandon. The weight of it all was crushing. The fear of her people, the despair of her army, the betrayal of her officers. Cleopatra retreated into the heart of her palace, the grand halls now feeling like a gilded cage. She locked herself away, not in defiant, but in defiance. Behind the ornate doors, surrounded by the ghosts of her ancestors, the great Ptolemaic rulers, she began to plan. Her mind, as sharp and brilliant as ever, raced through strategies, contingencies, and desperate gambles. She was a queen cornered, a lioness, protecting her den. From her chambers, she dispatched messengers, her last remaining loyal servants, to Octavian's camp. Her letters were a masterclass in diplomacy, a delicate dance of pride and pragmatism. She pleaded, not for herself, but for her children. She offered to abdicate, to renounce her throne, if only Octavian would allow her son Caesarion to rule, or, if not him, her other children by Antony. She was fighting for the future of her dynasty, for the survival of Egypt is something more than just another Roman province. "Let me keep my kingdom," she argued, "even as a client state of Rome. Let my bloodline continue." It was a desperate plea from a mother and a queen, trying to salvage something from the ashes of her world. But Octavian was not a man swayed by sentiment. He was cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. His ambition was a bottomless pit, and it had no room for a rival dynasty, especially one that carried the blood of Julius Caesar. His replies were curt, evasive, and laced with a chilling promise of clemency if she would only submit. He offered her personal safety, a guarantee that no harm would come to her. It was a poisoned chalice. Cleopatra, a master of political theater and human psychology, saw through his words with perfect clarity. He didn't want her dead. A dead queen was a martyr, a legend. No, Octavian wanted her alive. He had a very specific and humiliating purpose for her. He envisioned a grand triumphal parade through the streets of Rome, a spectacle to celebrate his ultimate victory. And in that parade, he needed a centerpiece, a final, dazzling prize to display to the Roman masses. He wanted Cleopatra, the formidable queen of Egypt, the lover of Caesar and Antony, walking in chains behind his chariot. He wanted to parade her not as a fellow ruler, but as a trophy, a symbol of his absolute power, the final conquest that would make him master of the world. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her every offer was pointless. Her every plea was falling on deaf ears. There was no negotiation to be had. He wasn't interested in her kingdom or her children's future. He was interested in her humiliation. The choice she faced was not between victory and defeat, but between a dignified death and a life of public shame. Back in her fortress-like mausoleum, a tomb she had been building for herself, she made her final preparations. The world she had known was collapsing. Antony was gone, her army was dissolving, and her enemy was at the gates, demanding not her crown, but her soul. As the sounds of Roman soldiers finally breaching the city's defenses grew louder, a strange calm settled over her. She had played her last card. The game was over. Now, all that was left was to choose how she would leave the board. She would not be a trophy. She would not be a footnote in Octavian's story. She was Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, and she would script her own ending. The world would remember her as a queen, right to the very end. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about the final days of history's most fascinating figures, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Have you ever heard a story so tragic, so filled with love and loss, that it stays with you forever? The tale of Antony and Cleopatra is one of those timeless epics. It's not just a historical account. It's a gut-wrenching drama about power, passion, and the devastating consequences of a single piece of false news. Let's dive into the final, heartbreaking chapter of their lives. Imagine the scene. The great Roman general, Mark Antony, is reeling from his defeat against Octavian at the Battle of Actium. His ships are lost, his legions have deserted him, and his reputation is in tatters. He's a man who has lost everything, or so he thinks. In this moment of utter despair, a messenger arrives with the worst possible news. Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt, the woman he loves more than life itself, is dead. For Antony, this was the final blow. The world without Cleopatra was a world not worth living in. His honor was gone. His power was gone. And now, his love was gone. Consumed by grief and a profound sense of shame, he saw only one way out. He made the irreversible decision to end his own life, to follow his queen into the afterlife. It was a tragic choice, fueled by misinformation and despair. But here's where the story takes its most cruel turn. The news was false. Cleopatra was alive. She had secluded herself in her monument, a grand tomb she had prepared, waiting for the inevitable arrival of Octavian's forces. But she was very much alive. When Antony learned the truth, it was already too late. He had inflicted a fatal wound upon himself. His loyal attendants, finding him wounded and weak, carried him to Cleopatra's monument. Can you picture the agony of that moment? They had to hoist the dying general up the stone walls to get him to her, as she had sealed herself inside. Cleopatra, seeing the man she loved bleeding and fading, was shattered. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. She held him in her arms, this once mighty Roman, now just a man dying in the embrace of his queen. In those final moments, they were together, but it was a reunion tainted by the deepest sorrow. As Antony passed away, Cleopatra's world collapsed entirely. Think about what she lost in that instant. He wasn't just her lover, the man whose passion matched her own. He was her most crucial political partner, the Roman general who had legitimized her rule and protected her kingdom. He was the father of her children. He was her protector against a hostile Roman world that saw her as a foreign temptress. With Antony gone, she was completely and utterly alone, facing her ruthless enemy Octavian, with no one left to stand by her side. The fall of Antony marked the beginning of the end for Cleopatra. Her protector was gone, her army was gone, and her hope was extinguished. She was no longer a queen commanding the world's stage with her wit and influence. She was a prisoner in her own land, her fate in the hands of the man who had destroyed her life and her love. The death of Antony wasn't just the end of a man. It was the end of an era, and the final, lonely chapter for the last pharaoh of Egypt. The story of Antony and Cleopatra is a powerful reminder of how love, ambition, and misunderstanding can lead to ultimate tragedy. It's a story that has captivated people for centuries, and for good reason. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this glimpse into history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories from the past. The dust hadn't even settled in Alexandria, but for Cleopatra, the world had already ended. Octavian's soldiers, disciplined and relentless, flooded into the royal palace. It wasn't a brutal, chaotic storming. It was a cold, methodical takeover. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was captured. But this wasn't the kind of capture that ends in a swift, merciful death. Octavian was far more cunning than that. She was treated with a chilling, calculated respect. She was still in her palace, surrounded by the opulence she had always known, but it was no longer her home. It was a golden cage. Guards were her constant shadows. They stood at every door, their eyes following her every move. She couldn't walk from one room to another without their silent, imposing presence. Her privacy was gone. Every conversation was overheard. Every sigh was noted. The freedom she had wielded with such power and charisma was now a distant memory. She was a queen without a kingdom, a ruler without power. Her commands fell on deaf ears. The servants who once rushed to fulfill her every whim now answered to Roman officers. Imagine the torment, living amidst the symbols of your absolute power, now completely powerless. The sun still rose over her city, but it no longer shone for her. The Nile still flowed, but it no longer carried her authority. She was a ghost in her own life, a living monument to a fallen dynasty. But it was the future that truly terrified her. Octavian's plans for her were far more cruel than a simple execution. He intended to take her back to Rome. Not as a guest, not as a respected former rival, but as the ultimate prize in his triumphal procession. The thought alone was a poison seeping into her soul. She, Cleopatra, descendant of Ptolemy, lover of Caesar and Antony, the Queen of Kings, would be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains. The Roman crowds would gawk and jeer. They would see her not as the brilliant politician and leader she was, but as an exotic barbarian, a defeated enemy, a spectacle for their amusement. For a woman of her immense pride and dignity, this public humiliation was a fate worse than any death imaginable. The idea of being reduced to a trophy, her legacy tarnished forever in the minds of the people, was an unbearable torment. It would be the final, crossing blow, not just to her, but to the memory of Egypt itself. And then there were her children. What would become of them? Her son, with Caesar, Caesarion, had been proclaimed a king. What mercy would Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, show to a potential rival? And her children with Antony. Their future was now in the hands of the man who had destroyed their father. She was trapped, with the weight of her own impending humiliation and the terrifying uncertainty of her children's fate crushing her spirit. In these final, desperate days, surrounded by enemies and stripped of all hope, Cleopatra began to weigh her options. The golden cage was closing in, and the shadow of Rome loomed large and menacing. She knew she could not allow Octavian his ultimate victory. She could not allow herself to become a footnote in his story, a chained queen in his parade. Her mind, as sharp and strategic as ever, began to search for one final move. one last act of defiance to reclaim her narrative and escape the unbearable shame that awaited her. She was a queen to the very end, and she would choose her own destiny. Thank you for watching. If you're fascinated by the dramatic final chapters of history's most iconic figures, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more stories like this. See you in the next video. The final days of Cleopatra were a masterclass in political maneuvering, a desperate gambit played against the most powerful man in the world. After the devastating defeat at Actium and the subsequent death of Mark Antony, Cleopatra found herself cornered, a queen without an army, a ruler in a gilded cage. Yet, she was not one to simply accept her fate. She was Cleopatra, a descendant of Ptolemy, a woman who had charmed both Caesar and Antony. She believed she had one last card to play: negotiation. She sent envoys to Octavian, the man who now held her destiny in his hands. Her offer was staggering. She proposed to relinquish her throne, to hand over the immense wealth of Egypt, a treasure trove accumulated over centuries. She offered to place her kingdom and her children under his protection, effectively surrendering everything she had fought for. All she asked for in return was a sliver of dignity, the assurance that her children would be allowed to rule, and that she herself would be treated not as a common prisoner, but as a queen who had yielded. Octavian, ever the cool-headed strategist, received her messengers. He listened with an air of polite consideration, his face an unreadable mask. He acknowledged her offers, the vast sums of gold, the grain that could feed Rome for years. He even expressed a degree of sympathy for her plight, but when it came to the crucial point, her personal fate, he remained evasively silent. He made no promises. He offered no guarantees of safety or honor. He simply said he would consider her proposals. This calculated ambiguity was more chilling than an outright refusal. In that chilling silence, Cleopatra, a woman attuned to the subtlest shifts in power, understood everything. His politeness was a trap, his lack of commitment a death sentence for her pride. She saw his true intentions with horrifying clarity. Octavian didn't just want her kingdom, they wanted heir. He wanted to parade her through the streets of Rome in his triumph, a grand spectacle to celebrate his ultimate victory. She would be the star exhibit, the exotic Eastern queen, shackled in golden chains, a living symbol of his conquest and Rome's supremacy. The thought was unbearable, a humiliation far worse than death. For a queen who had commanded empires, the idea of being a public spectacle, a trophy for the mob to gawk at, was an agony she could not endure. With this grim realization, a profound shift occurred within her. The desperate hope for a negotiated peace vanished, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. If she could not control her life, she would, by the gods, control her death. The time for diplomacy was over. The time for preparation had begun. She retreated into her private chambers within the mausoleum, where she had taken refuge. This was no longer a fortress against Octavian's soldiers, but a sanctuary for her final moments. She began to systematically put her affairs in order, a queen making her last royal decree. She gathered her most treasured personal items, not for safekeeping, but for a final farewell. Each jewel, each scroll, was a memory of a life lived at the apex of power and passion. She spent hours writing. Letters were dispatched to Octavian, not a supplication, but a final instruction, detailing her wish to be buried beside Antony. It was her last act of defiance, a demand that even in death, her love would triumph over his victory. She wrote to her children words of love and sorrow, a mother's final, heartbreaking goodbye. Then, she turned to her most loyal servants, the women who had been with her through triumph and tragedy. Iras and Charmian. There were no grand speeches, only quiet, whispered conversations. They spoke not as queen and subjects, but as women facing the inevitable together. They understood her decision without question. Their loyalty was absolute, not to the crown, but to the woman who wore it. Every action was deliberate, imbued with a solemn grace. She was reclaiming her agency, scripting her own final scene. The world outside could clamor for her capture. Octavian could plan his glorious parade. But within the stone walls of her tomb, Cleopatra was the one in command. She chose to exit the world stage not as a captive, but as a queen, on her own terms, forever immortalized, not by Octavian's triumph, but by her own legendary choice. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into history, Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from the past.